At 30, Alexander Reed had become one of Europe's most powerful young billionaires. Born into a middle-class family in Liverpool, he built Axiom Dynamics, a global software empire, in just 8 years. From the glass-walled office on the 60th floor of a London skyscraper, Alexander looked down at the city as if it belonged to him. He had everything: a multi-million-pound penthouse, a gleaming collection of Italian supercars, an opulent yacht, and a private jet, always ready on call. The press hailed him as the Prince of British Tech, a symbol of success and charisma. Beside him stood Isabella Hart, the nation's leading actress, a magazine cover face and a red carpet fixture. In public, they were the perfect couple, a romance straight out of a storybook. But behind the spotlight, Alexander felt a silent void. Day after day, a question nagged at him. Did Isabella love him for who he was, or for the fame and fortune that came with his name? Small details planted doubt, her radiant smile when she received extravagant gifts, but distant eyes when they talked about fears or hard times. Her dazzling presence at events, but absence when he needed her most. Alexander's analytical instincts as an entrepreneur led him to a cold conclusion. Perhaps she loved the halo, not the man. One autumn evening, London lights sparkling beyond the penthouse windows, Alexander sat in silence with an untouched glass of whiskey, and a reckless thought flashed across his mind. The plan was both cruel and dangerous, yet he believed it could reveal the truth. If Isabella truly loved him, she would stay, even if he were no longer Alexander Reed, the admired, wealthy icon. If not, stripping him of everything would expose her. That night, he called Marcus Hale, his private physician and a childhood friend. Marcus was nearly speechless when he heard the plan. Alexander wanted to stage a car accident that would leave him paralyzed from the waist down. Marcus vehemently objected. "Alex, do you know what you're doing? This isn't a game. You'll hurt people and live a lie." But looking into his friend's eyes, hard and tired at once, Marcus realized Alex had made up his mind. Gradually using his medical expertise and necessary contacts, the two began to map out details, fabricating medical records, hiring professional equipment, and staging a convincingly realistic scene. Alexander disappeared for several days, then returned with the story of a terrible car accident. From that moment on, he appeared in a wheelchair, feigning complete dependence on the care of others. That night, Alexander tossed and turned, unable to sleep. He wondered when morning came, and Isabella heard that the man beside her would never be the same again. Would her eyes still hold the same light as before? The truth would soon be revealed. News of Alexander's accident spread rapidly across the media. Headlines screamed, "Tech Prince in devastating car crash faces lifetime in a wheelchair." When Marcus called Isabella, her voice faltered for a second before quickly regaining composure. "I'll fly back right away," she said. But Alexander, long accustomed to reading body language and silences, did not miss that strange hesitation hidden behind her words of comfort. That night, the roar of Isabella's Bentley echoed down the gravel driveway of the estate. Alexander's heart pounded as if he were about to close a billion-pound deal. He was already seated in his wheelchair, hands trembling slightly on the armrest. The door opened and Isabella stepped inside, as though she were walking onto a red carpet. She wore a sleek, black Chanel dress, her hair styled perfectly, her face flawless with makeup. For a brief moment, Alexander felt as if he were watching a film premiere, not a woman rushing to the side of the man she loved. Her perfection so polished, it felt artificial, chilled him more than the staged accident itself. Isabella rushed forward, but every movement was calculated, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Alexander, my love, this is dreadful." Her voice trembled, yet her eyes avoided his, refusing to meet his gaze. When Alexander, playing the role of a paralyzed man, told her that the doctors warned recovery could take months, even years, or perhaps he might never walk again, he caught a fleeting flicker of disappointment in Isabella's eyes. It was gone so quickly, most people would have missed it, but to Alexander, it was as clear as figures on a financial report. "Of course, I'll be by your side," Isabella replied. But almost immediately, she began listing a string of commitments. She could not miss a jewelry campaign in Paris, a movie premiere in Los Angeles, Fashion Week in Milan. To anyone else, they might have sounded like professional obligations, but to Alexander's ears, they were nothing more than excuses to stay away. Within just 24 hours, Isabella was gone. She boarded a first-class flight out of London, leaving Alexander alone in the heavy silence that blanketed the mansion. Watching her figure fade from view, a painful certainty welled up inside him. The love he had trusted for so long was nothing more than a fragile illusion. After Isabella's departure, the vast house sank into an oppressive emptiness. The grand halls, once ablaze with lavish parties, now echoed only with the solitary sound of his wheelchair wheels. And it was then that another presence, quiet yet steadfast, began to shine. Clara Bennett. Clara had worked for Alexander for more than 3 years, yet he had scarcely ever noticed her. At 26, she was an ordinary young woman with dark hair, always neatly tied back, dressed simply and practically, moving silently through the mansion with a care that few could rival. To Alexander, she had always been just a shadow, lingering in the backdrop of his opulent life. But now, in the vast quiet, he began to truly see her. The morning after Isabella left, Clara entered his room carrying a silver tray. On it was a carefully prepared breakfast, perfectly cooked fried eggs, a steaming cappuccino, fresh apple juice, and golden crisp toast. "I remember you like it this way," Clara said softly, setting the tray down and gently adjusting the pillow behind his back with natural, unforced movements. For the first time, Alexander found himself surprised by the quiet sincerity in her care. Unlike Isabella, Clara's eyes held no pity or sense of obligation, only warmth, like a small, patient flame burning in the depths of winter. Day after day, Clara remained by his side in the smallest of ways, pulling up the blanket on cold nights, reading to him when he couldn't sleep patiently, listening to his heavy thoughts. She never rushed, never complained. Her care was as natural as breathing. One afternoon, Alexander asked why she had chosen this job in London. After a brief hesitation, she revealed that her younger sister, Amelia, had been born with a congenital heart defect and needed an extremely costly surgery. Back home in Cornwall, the waiting list was impossibly long, so Clara had left working tirelessly in London to save every penny. The surgery had succeeded, and now Amelia was studying medicine, dreaming of becoming a doctor to save children like herself. Hearing this, Alexander felt his chest tighten. This ordinary girl, who had quietly lived in his house for 3 years, carried within her a story of sacrifice and resilience he had never once noticed. In the golden glow of sunset through the window, Alexander realized Clara was not just a housekeeper. She was the embodiment of gentle strength and sincerity, the very things he had overlooked in a world blinded by wealth and glamour. In the days that followed, a subtle change unfolded between Alexander and Clara, so delicate that neither of them noticed it at first. Short exchanges grew into conversations that stretched for hours. The distance between employer and servant quietly dissolved, leaving only two souls learning to listen to one another. For Alexander, who was accustomed to cold boardrooms and soulless reports, it was startling to discover Clara's deep knowledge of literature and language. She spoke of the novels she once cherished, of the Italian poems she had translated during her university days. He listened quietly, as though his mind were opening to a simple yet deeply meaningful world. Clara, on the other hand, saw a completely different Alexander. Not the arrogant tech magnate who graced magazine covers, but a man who knew how to listen, sometimes awkward, sometimes strangely vulnerable. One evening, when Alexander confessed that his greatest fear in life was loneliness, something he had never told anyone, Clara simply placed her hand gently on his shoulder. No words were needed. That light touch was enough to make him feel he was no longer alone. There were small moments, but they etched themselves deeply into Alexander's heart. Like the night when his back pain charade made him grimace, Clara prepared a sofa in his room to stay overnight, ready to wake at any moment if he needed her. That night, Alexander lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing in the dark. Around 3 a.m., he cracked his eyes open and saw her stir, quietly adjusting his blanket and tenderly brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. In a trembling whisper filled with affection, she said, "Please get well soon. I can't bear to see you like this." Alexander bit his lip, struggling to hold back, but his chest tightened with a sweet ache. In that moment, he understood an undeniable truth. Clara loved him, not for power or wealth, but for the man he truly was. From that day on, Alexander's gaze toward Clara changed completely. He noticed every little detail about her, the way she softly hummed old melodies while tidying the crease on her brow when engrossed in an old novel, the infinite patience with which she listened to his hidden fears. One morning, as Clara brought in his breakfast, Alexander suddenly asked Clara, "If I could never walk again, what would you think of me?" Setting down the tray, Clara looked straight into his eyes, her voice unwavering. "You would still be Alexander Reed, a man who is intelligent, kind, who brings laughter to others, and who has a generous heart. Your legs don't define who you are." Shaken, Alexander pressed further. "And if I needed care for the rest of my life?" Clara gave a faint smile, her eyes shining with sincerity. "Then I would stay. For the rest of my life." In that moment, Alexander realized he had found something his brilliant career could never give him, a love that was pure, selfless, and free of ambition. And yet, as those tender days passed, a quiet doubt began to stir in Clara's heart. Having spent years caring for a gravely ill relative, she knew all too well the difference between a true patient and someone pretending. It started with small details. Although Alexander constantly claimed to be paralyzed, his legs remained firm and strong, showing none of the muscle atrophy she had seen in real patients. Once, when she accidentally dropped a book near his feet, Clara saw Alexander reflexively pull his leg back. She froze for a moment, then pretended not to notice. Another night, as he slept, she noticed his toes twitching slightly in a dreamlike rhythm. Individually, those details seemed harmless, but when put together, they painted a portrait of doubt. The suspicion grew until one afternoon, while tidying Alexander's study, Clara stumbled upon several medical files left forgotten on the desk. With her familiarity with medical terms from years of caring for her sister, she immediately recognized that the reports were vague, as if written by someone with no expertise. Clara's heart pounded as she flipped through the pages, her hands trembling uncontrollably. That night, she did something desperate. She opened Alexander's safe. She knew the code, her mother's birth date, because she had once overheard him mention it. When the heavy door swung open, the sight inside stole her breath. There were contracts between Alexander and Dr. Marcus, clearly labeled non-traditional medical consulting services, emails discussing staging scenarios, and observing reactions invoices for rented wheelchairs and fake medical equipment. Everything was there, laid bare, undeniable. Clara collapsed into a chair, the paper slipping from her hands. Tears ran silently down her cheeks. It had all been a lie. The nights she stayed up caring for him, the whispered prayers, the hopes she had nurtured. It had all been a performance with Alexander as both director and actor. And, the bitterest truth, she had fallen in love with him amid that deception. Not having the courage to confront him, Clara made a decision. She packed her things quietly and left a short resignation letter on the kitchen table. At 3 a.m, she called a taxi, hauled her suitcase through the silent mansion, and closed the door behind her, taking her broken heart with her. At dawn, Alexander came down to the kitchen and found it empty. Only a neatly folded sheet of paper remained on the table, Clara's resignation. No accusations, no explanations, just a few lines and her signature. But each word felt like a knife cutting deep into him. Alexander felt his world collapse. All the money, fame, and power, the things he had believed could buy anything, suddenly meant nothing. He sank into a chair, clutching the letter until it was creased and crumpled. He had never felt so alone. In despair, he called Marcus immediately. His voice trembled. "She knows everything, Marcus. She's gone. I have to find her, no matter the cost." On the other end of the line, Henry sighed. "Alexander, perhaps the best thing you can do for Clara is to let her go. You've gone too far." But Alexander almost shouted, "No, I love her. This is no longer a plan, no longer an experiment. She's the only person who ever truly saw me." Alexander launched a search. But in a city of millions, finding Clara, a young woman with few connections and no trace left behind, proved harder than any financial deal he had ever faced. Day after day, there was no news. It was only then that he finally understood he had lost the most precious thing of all. The very moment he realized he could not live without it. He realized that being one of the wealthiest men in London no longer meant anything when what he longed for most was a woman who had every reason to avoid him. Clara had vanished from London as if she had never existed. Each day without her was a torment. Alexander immediately abandoned the charade, walking normally again. Yet ironically, that was when he truly felt paralyzed. Paralyzed by guilt, by the fear that he had lost forever the woman he loved. He hired 3 private investigation firms, placed ads in the newspapers, and scoured cheap hotels across the city. But Clara seemed to have evaporated into thin air. Only one clue remained. She had withdrawn all of her savings $55,000 after 3 years of work. On the 5th day, Isabella returned from Milan, stunned to see Alexander walking as though nothing had ever happened. He had even forgotten her existence. When Isabella cheerfully suggested they go to Marba as they had planned before the accident, without even asking a single question about the week he was supposedly paralyzed, Alexander saw the truth. She only cared about her own pleasures. In that very moment, he ended their relationship for good. That night, in the emptiness of his mansion, Alexander conceived a new path. If he could not find Clara, he would turn to her younger sister Amelia, who was studying medicine. He found her in the university library, surrounded by towering stacks of books. The girl looked up, her eyes, so like Clara's, deep bright, but carrying a cutting coldness. When Alexander introduced himself, Amelia slammed her book shut, her voice tense. "Do you have any idea how badly you hurt my sister?" she cried, for 3 whole days when she came back home. Alexander collapsed inwardly and confessed everything. He told her he did not expect forgiveness, only that she deliver a message to Clara, that he loved her, that he regretted his deceit more than anything in his life, that if he could give up all his wealth, fame, and career to turn back time, he would do so without hesitation. Amelia remained silent for a long time, gazing straight into his face. Finally, she said quietly, "If you truly love my sister, let her be. She deserves a love without lies." Alexander lowered his head, his heart as heavy as stone. Yet, in that abyss of despair, at least he knew Clara had heard the truest confession of his life, even if only through her sister. After that encounter, Alexander returned to London, his heart heavier than ever. He thought perhaps the kindest act of love he could offer Clara was to let her find peace, to allow her to rebuild her life far away from the pain he had caused. But miles away in a small rented room in Brighton, Clara read every message Amelia had relayed. Alexander's remorse had reached her stirring feelings. She thought had been buried forever. 2 weeks after his meeting with Amelia, Alexander came back to London with a heart weighed down like stone. The grand mansion had become nothing more than a gilded mausoleum, every room echoing with Clara's memory. The kitchen, where she had lovingly prepared breakfast, the living room, where their conversations had once filled the air, the bedroom where she had stayed awake to watch over him. He lived like a shadow in that house, working mechanically, eating absent-mindedly, and tossing sleeplessly through nights haunted by regret. Then, on a cold, gray November morning, the doorbell rang. The postman handed him a parcel from Cardiff. Inside was a handwritten letter, the familiar soft strokes of Clara's pen. She wrote that if Alexander had truly changed, she would give him a chance to explain. She asked to meet him at Hyde Park at 3 p.m. the next day, the place where 3 years earlier they had first crossed paths, though Alexander no longer remembered. At exactly 2 p.m., Alexander was already at the park. He sat on a wooden bench, gripping tightly the small silver cross, a gift from his mother, once thought lost, now returned by Clara, along with her letter. Every passing minute stretched into eternity. At 3 o'clock sharp, he saw Clara walking toward him along a path strewn with golden leaves. She wore a simple beige coat, her hair loose and natural, her face thinner, but her eyes still shining. They stopped before each other, only a few steps apart, yet the distance felt like an ocean. Clara recounted how 3 years earlier, in that very place, she had sat crying on a stone bench, terrified She would fail her job interview at Whitmore Manor. That morning, Alexander had been out jogging, and he had stopped, handed her a handkerchief, and said, "Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it." In that moment, she had been moved by the kindness in his eyes. But after starting the job, she saw only a cold, distant Alexander, hiding behind money and ambition. It wasn't until the week he pretended to be paralyzed that she caught a glimpse of the man who had once inspired her admiration. And so his betrayal cut even deeper. Hearing her words, Alexander sank to his knees on the damp grass, his trembling hands clasping hers. His voice broke as he whispered, "I swear I will never deceive you again. If you give me one chance, I will spend the rest of my life proving that you deserve every ounce of love this world can hold." Clara bent down, her heart stirred by the sincerity burning in his eyes. After a brief hesitation, she gave a small nod. "Just one chance, Alexander. If there's ever another lie, it will end forever." Clara looked at the powerful man now kneeling in love before her, and the wall of pain in her heart began to crack. She urged him to stand softly, reminding, "People are watching." He replied, "I don't care about anyone else. I only care about you." When their hands touched, both felt the flame of love that had never truly gone out. Clara agreed to give him a chance, just one chance. If there was ever another lie, it would all be over. Alexander squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes blazing. One chance for him, that was enough. In that moment, Alexander felt reborn. Beneath the fading winter sky, they walked side by side slowly, as if the world itself had granted them a second chance. That afternoon, after their meeting at Hyde Park, Alexander drove Clara back to Whitmore Manor. The car rolled slowly over the gravel road, the same path Clara had walked countless times as a servant. But today, each crunch beneath the wheels sounded like the heartbeat of a new beginning. When the heavy wooden doors of the manor opened, Clara paused at the familiar threshold. To her, this house had once been the symbol of distance, an unbridgeable chasm between a wealthy master and a simple maid. But this time, when Alexander opened the door and held out his hand, his gaze was no longer that of a proud billionaire, but of a man learning to love with unguarded sincerity. The house was unchanged, oil paintings lining the hallway, the spiral oak staircase, tall windows flooded with sunset light. Yet to Clara, the space felt transformed. She stepped into the kitchen, the place of countless mornings spent preparing meals, and for the first time, not as a servant, but as someone cherished. Alexander followed quietly behind, watching every shift in her expression, as though afraid that with the slightest hesitation, she might turn and walk away. That night, they sat together in the living room by the blazing fireplace. Alexander spoke of the years he had lived behind a cold facade, of the fear of showing weakness, and of the misguided scheme that had nearly cost him everything. Clara listened, her eyes sometimes glistening with tears, but she never interrupted. When he ended with a vow to live by truth, from now on, Clara gave a small nod. "I believe you, but I will trust your actions more than your words." In that moment, Alexander moved closer and took her hand. They sat in silence for a long while, hearing only the crackle of fire and the rhythm of their joined hearts. At last, Alexander kissed Clara, not the kiss of a man seeking possession, but the trembling kiss of someone who had once lost everything and now realized he had found the one treasure he must never risk losing again. In the days that followed, Clara slowly grew accustomed to her new role. She was no longer the housekeeper, but Alexander's companion. They shared breakfast on the balcony, strolled leisurely through the winter gardens, and spent hours simply talking about the simplest, most ordinary things. For Clara, every moment was proof that Alexander had truly changed. For Alexander, it was salvation. Every smile from Clara seemed to erase a piece of the darkness inside him. One early morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Alexander turned to Clara, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't know what the future holds, but there is one thing I am certain of. If you are by my side, I will never fear anything again." Clara smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. And for the first time, after all the storms, they both felt they had finally found the place where they truly belonged. After many days of living in this newfound peace, Alexander knew there was only one way to prove to Clara that he had truly changed by turning their love into a lifelong promise. The thought of proposing came to him on a winter morning when he saw Clara sitting in the manor's small library, absorbed in an old novel, her lips touched with the faintest smile. In that moment, Alexander realized this was the woman he wanted by his side for the rest of his life. He began to plan. No extravagance, no spectacle, no flashing lights, no media lenses. Those were the very things that had once made him lose himself, and he would never repeat that mistake. What he wanted was only a simple evening, just the two of them, bound by words spoken with absolute sincerity. Alexander chose the winter garden behind the manor, the place where Clara often walked each morning. He asked the gardener to line the path with candles, to hang small lanterns on the bare branches so that golden light would fall gently across the thin layer of snow. At the garden center, he set a small, round table and prepared a dinner with his own hands, awkward, imperfect, but filled with love. When Clara stepped outside and saw the scene, she froze, her eyes glistening. Alexander walked up to her, took her hand, his heart pounding, his voice trembling, yet every word clear. "Clara, I once lost you, and that was the greatest mistake of my life. I cannot promise life will always be easy, but I promise that from now on, I will love you with honesty, with respect, and with all of my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She needed no roses, no glittering diamonds, only the love she saw shining so clearly in his gaze. She nodded softly, whispering, "Yes, Alexander, I will." In the glow of hundreds of flickering candles, they embraced tightly. That kiss was not only the beginning of a marriage, but also the seal of redemption, a lasting affirmation that two souls who had once lost each other had now found one another forever. Alexander and Clara's wedding took place 1 year after the proposal in the very same winter garden behind the manor where he had once knelt to beg for her love. No extravagance, no flashing lights, no famous guests, only family close friends and those who had witnessed Alexander's transformation. Amelia, now a medical graduate, stood proudly beside her sister, her eyes radiant with happiness. Marcus was there too, smiling quietly, as he watched his childhood friend finally find true peace. And when Clara walked down the path, strewn with white petals, Alexander's heart seemed to stop. He had once possessed all the wealth the world admired, but only now did Alexander truly understand. Real riches were not measured by the numbers in a bank account. But in the moment, Clara walked toward him to become his lifelong companion. After the wedding, they built a simple yet deeply fulfilling life. Alexander abandoned the glittering lifestyle and instead chose to spend more time with Clara. They strolled through parks together, cooked humble meals, and shared moments so small they seemed invisible. But in truth, they were priceless. 2 years later, Clara gave birth to a baby girl they named Grace, a symbol of salvation and blessing. When Alexander first held his tiny daughter in his arms, he wept like a child. I used to think the greatest success of my life was the company, the numbers on the stock exchange, he whispered to Clara. But now I know the greatest success is having you and our child. Clara smiled gently, brushing his disheveled hair, her eyes glistening. We've endured so much loss, Alexander. But because of that, we truly understand the value of this happiness. The mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and deception, had now become a true home. The laughter of a child echoed through its vast halls, blending with warm evenings by the fireplace. No longer were there boundaries between master and servant billionaire and ordinary girl. There was only a family bound by love. Every weekend, Alexander and Clara would take Grace to Hyde Park, the place where they had found each other again after so much pain. On the old wooden bench beneath the tree, they would sit hand in hand, watching their daughter run and play. To them, it was living proof that true love could blossom, even when born out of mistakes. Their story was not a fairy tale, but a reality forged through grief, loss, and forgiveness. It was a reminder that sometimes one must lose everything to recognize what truly matters. That true love is not measured by diamonds or supercars, but by sincerity, quiet sacrifices, and the strength to forgive. Above all, their story proved one thing: happiness is not about finding a perfect person, but about finding someone who can see you at your weakest and still choose to stay.